How long has it been going on? I asked before she even set her purse down, and the sound of my voice made her freeze mid-step, that bright, careless smile still hanging on her lips like it didn't belong to the moment anymore, like it had walked in from somewhere else and hadn't realized it was about to die right there in our living room. Olivia blinked at me, just once, slow and confused, like she was trying to decide which version of the night she was stepping into. The one she expected or the one I had been quietly building without her knowing, and for a second neither of us moved, the clock on the wall ticking louder than it ever had, each second stretching thin between us like something ready to snap. I stayed seated in the dark, the only light coming from the kitchen behind her, outlining her silhouette, her dress slightly wrinkled, her hair too perfectly undone to be accidental, and there it was, that faint scent that didn't belong to our house. Something sharper, unfamiliar, the kind of detail you don't notice unless you've already started looking for it, unless something inside you has already shifted from trust to quiet calculation. She let out a small laugh, soft, controlled, the kind she used when she thought she could smooth things over without actually answering anything, and she said, "Ethan, what are you talking about?" Like this was a misunderstanding, like I had just asked her something ridiculous instead of something that had been sitting in my chest for weeks, growing heavier. With every late night, every unexplained meeting, every moment she thought I wasn't paying attention, but I didn't move, didn't raise my voice, didn't give her anything she could push against, because the truth is, anger is loud, and I had already passed that stage. What I felt now was colder, steadier, something that didn't rush, something that waited. I leaned forward just enough for the light to catch my face, and I watched her expression change, not dramatically, not in some obvious way, but in the smallest shift around her eyes, the tightening she couldn't fully control, and that was all I needed, because betrayal doesn't announce itself, it leaks out in moments like that, quiet and undeniable. 8 years of marriage doesn't collapse in a single night, it erodes, slowly, almost politely. Until one day you realize the foundation you thought was solid has been hollow for a long time, and standing there in front of me, Olivia looked like someone who still believed she was safe. Like her dirty secret was still tucked neatly out of reach, like the life we built together was something she could step in and out of without consequence. I let the silence stretch just a little longer, long enough for discomfort to settle in. Long enough for her to feel that something was off in a way she couldn't fix with a smile or a quick excuse, and then I said it again, quieter this time, almost calm enough to sound reasonable. "I'm not asking twice." And that's when the room changed, not because of anything loud or dramatic, but because something invisible between us finally snapped into place, and for the first time that night, she realized she wasn't in control of the story anymore. Olivia set her purse down slowly, like she was buying time with every movement, her eyes scanning my face for cracks, for anger, for anything she could use, but I gave her nothing, just that same steady look that had been building long before tonight, and she shifted her weight, crossing her arms like she was cold even though the house was warm, and she said, "You are being paranoid." But the word landed weak, like she did not fully believe it herself. The silence pressed in again, heavier now. And I could see the calculation starting behind her eyes, the quick search for a version of the truth she could shape into something safe, something that would keep her world intact. But this was the problem with a toxic lie, it needs momentum to survive, and I had already stopped everything. I remembered the first time something felt off, a Tuesday night 3 weeks ago, when she came home later than usual, laughing at a message she would not show me, brushing it off like it was nothing, and back then I told myself not to read into it, that trust meant giving someone the benefit of the doubt, but betrayal does not arrive loudly, it settles in quietly, piece by piece, until it becomes impossible to ignore. I leaned back in my chair, slow and controlled, and said, "Then explain the hotel on Westbrook, the one you checked into last Friday at 9:18 p.m. And for the first time her composure cracked, not dramatically, just a flicker, but enough, her lips parting like she was about to speak and then stopping because she realized there was no easy way out of that detail. Her eyes dropped for half a second before snapping back to mine, and that was when I knew, not because of what she said, but because of what she could not say. And in that moment the truth was no longer something I was chasing. It was something standing right there between us, undeniable, heavy, and very real. I did not raise my voice, and that seemed to bother her more than anything else, because Olivia was used to reactions she could manage, arguments she could redirect, emotions she could twist into something harmless. But calm does not give you anything to work with, calm just sits there and waits, and I had been waiting longer than she realized. She took a step back, subtle, like distance might give her space to think. And she said my name softer this time, like she was trying a different approach, something closer to concern. Ethan, you are overthinking this. But even she could hear how thin it sounded, how it did not quite land the way she needed it to, and I could see it in her posture, the way her shoulders were no longer relaxed, the way her fingers curled slightly like she needed something to hold onto. I let out a slow breath and glanced toward the kitchen counter where my phone rested, screen dark, silent, holding more truth than she was ready to face, and I said, I thought so too at first. Because that was the truth. I had doubted myself before I ever doubted her. I had told myself stories that made things easier to accept, that explained away the late nights and the sudden distance, and the way she stopped looking at me like I was part of her future. I stood up then, not abruptly, just enough to shift the balance in the room, and the movement made her straighten, like she was bracing for something she still could not define. And I walked past her slowly, close enough to catch that same unfamiliar scent again, a detail that used to mean nothing but now felt like evidence, like a fingerprint left in plain sight. 8 years is a long time to share a life with someone, long enough to learn the rhythm of their voice, the patterns of their habits, the small tells they do not even know they have. And Olivia had changed, not overnight, not in a way that could be pointed to in a single moment, but in a series of quiet shifts that only became obvious when you stepped back and looked at the whole picture. I reached the counter and picked up my phone, turning it over in my hand without unlocking it, and for a second I just held it there, feeling the weight of everything it contained, not just messages or receipts, but the end of something I had once believed was permanent. Behind me, she said. What is that supposed to mean? And there was an edge in her voice now, a hint of frustration breaking through the careful tone she had been trying to maintain, because uncertainty makes people uncomfortable, especially when they realize they are no longer the one controlling the narrative. I turned back toward her, meeting her eyes fully this time, and there was no anger in me, not anymore, just clarity, the kind that comes after you have already processed the worst part alone, and I said, "It means I stopped guessing." And that was the moment everything shifted again, because guessing leaves room for denial, but knowing does not. Knowing closes every door except the one that leads forward, and as she stood there searching my face for something she could still hold on to, I realized she had no idea how far ahead I already was, no idea that the version of me she thought she understood had been quietly replaced by someone who had already prepared for this exact moment. I unlocked the phone slowly, not to rush the moment but to let it settle, to let the weight of what was coming sink into the space between us, and Olivia's eyes followed the movement like she already knew something inside that screen was about to change everything, even if she was not ready to admit it yet. I did not hold it up right away, did not shove anything in her face, because this was never about catching her off guard. It was about showing her that every step she thought was hidden had been seen, recorded, understood, and quietly placed in order. "You stopped guessing," she repeated, her voice tighter now, like the words tasted wrong, like they did not fit the version of me she had built in her head, and I nodded once, calm, steady, because there was no need to explain something that would speak for itself. I tapped the screen and turned it toward her just enough for the light to reflect in her eyes, not revealing everything at once, just a single piece, a timestamp, a location, a confirmation that last Friday night was not what she claimed it was, and I watched her reaction carefully, not the words she might try to form, but the silence that came first, the hesitation that always arrives before a lie. She took a small step forward, like she needed to see it clearer, like distance was suddenly uncomfortable, and that was when I knew the shift was complete. She was no longer trying to control the story, she was trying to understand how much I already knew. "It is not what you think," she said quickly, too quickly, the kind of response that comes out before logic has time to shape it, and I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable, Because every toxic secret eventually reaches this point where denial becomes automatic, almost instinctive. I lowered the phone slightly, not taking my eyes off her, and said, "Then help me understand." And the way her expression changed again, more strained this time, more uncertain, told me everything I needed, because the truth does not need to be constructed, it stands on its own, and whatever she was about to say next, it was already too late to make it believable. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, like the right words were just out of reach, like she needed a few more seconds to build something that sounded real enough to survive, and that hesitation said more than any explanation ever could. I stayed exactly where I was, not stepping closer, not backing away, just holding the space steady so there was nowhere for her to escape to. Because this was the moment where everything either collapsed or revealed itself completely, and I had already seen enough to know which way it was going. "Ethan, you are taking this out of context," she finally said, her voice trying to find confidence again, but it wavered at the edges, like a structure built on something unstable, and I nodded slowly, almost encouraging, because I wanted to hear it. I wanted to see how far she would go to protect something that was already exposed. I turned the phone fully toward her this time, letting the screen light her face, showing more than just a single detail now, a sequence, a pattern. Times and places that connected too cleanly to be dismissed, and I watched as her expression shifted from denial to calculation, the kind that happens when someone realizes the story they planned is no longer enough. She took another step forward, closer than before, like proximity might somehow reduce the impact, and her eyes moved quickly across the screen, searching for gaps, for inconsistencies, for anything she could still argue against, but there were none. Because I had not rushed this, I had waited, observed, confirmed. "You went through my things?" she said suddenly, seizing on the only angle she thought she had left, turning it outward, trying to redirect the focus, and for the first time there was a hint of accusation in her tone, like she needed me to be the one in the wrong. I let out a quiet breath, not annoyed, not defensive, just steady, and said, "I paid attention." And that was the difference she could not undo. Because betrayal needs blindness to survive, and once you start seeing clearly, the entire structure begins to fall apart. She shook her head slightly, like she was rejecting the reality in front of her, like if she denied it hard enough it might still bend. But the room had already changed too much, the distance between us no longer physical but something deeper, something final, and standing there with the evidence reflected in her eyes, she was no longer deciding what to say. She was realizing she had run out of options. The room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than before, not tense, not explosive, just settled, like everything had finally reached the point where pretending was no longer possible, and Olivia stood there staring at the phone in my hand like it had rewritten something she thought was permanent, her version of control, her version of how this would go. I lowered the phone. Again, not hiding it, just removing the distraction. Because at this point the evidence was no longer the focus, the reality was, and I said, "It was not just last Friday." Letting the words sit between us without rushing to fill the silence that followed, because silence has a way of forcing truth to surface. Her eyes flickered, just for a second, and that was all it took, because people can deny a moment, they can argue a single instance, but patterns are different, patterns expose intent. And she knew exactly what I meant even before I explained it. "There were others," I continued, calm, measured, not accusing, just stating what had already been confirmed, and I could see it land not as shock, but as realization, like she understood the scale of what I knew was far beyond what she had prepared for. She shook her head again, softer this time, less certain, like the denial was no longer convincing even to her, and she said, "You are twisting things." But the words lacked direction, lacked structure, because you cannot twist something that has already been laid out clearly. I took a step closer now, not aggressive, just enough to close the distance that had grown between us, and I said, 3 months. And that was when everything shifted for the final time, because time is what turns a mistake into a decision, repetition into intention, and hearing it said out loud stripped away the last layer of defense she had left. Her shoulders dropped slightly, the first real sign of something breaking through, and in that moment she was no longer trying to argue the facts, she was trying to figure out how much damage had already been done, how much of her life was about to change because of something she thought she could keep hidden, and as I stood there watching her process it, I realized this was not about catching her anymore, this was about what came next. And she still did not understand that I had already decided that part. She did not argue the timeline again, and that silence told me more than anything she could have said, because when someone stops fighting the facts, it means they have shifted to something else, something quieter, something closer to damage control, and I could see it happening in real time, the way her posture changed, the way her eyes stopped searching for a way out, and started measuring what was left. "Ethan," she said, softer now, almost careful, like she was stepping onto unfamiliar ground. "We can talk about this." And there it was, not denial, not anger, but negotiation, the tone people use when they realize the situation is no longer in their favor and they need to salvage whatever they can. I watched her for a moment, not interrupting, because I wanted to see how far she would go without being pushed, and she took a small breath before continuing. "It did not mean anything." And that sentence hung in the air between us, fragile and empty, because meaning is not defined by intention alone, it is defined by action, by repetition, by the choices someone makes when they think no one is watching. I shook my head slightly, not in anger, just in clarity, and said, "It meant enough to hide." And that was the part she could not escape, the effort, the planning, the consistency of it all. Because a mistake happens once, but this had structure, this had intent. She looked down for the first time, really looked down, like the weight of everything was finally settling in, and when she looked back up, there was something different in her expression, not control, not confidence, just uncertainty, the kind that comes when someone realizes they are no longer steering the outcome. I set the phone down on the counter beside me, not needing it anymore, because the evidence had already done its job, and I said, "I have already taken care of what matters." Letting that sentence land slowly, because this was the part she had not considered, not what I knew, but what I had done with it, and the moment those words reached her, I saw it, the flicker of something sharper than fear, the realization that this was no longer just a conversation, it was a consequence she had not prepared for. Her eyes locked onto mine, sharper now, searching for something she could still hold on to, and she said, "What do you mean you took care of it?" But the confidence she tried to bring back into her voice did not land the same way anymore, because uncertainty had already settled in, and once that happens, every answer feels like a risk. I did not answer right away, not because I did not have one, but because timing matters, and I had learned that patience reveals more than pressure ever could. So I let the silence stretch just long enough for her to feel it, for her to start filling it with her own thoughts, her own fears. She took another step closer, faster this time, like she needed control back, like proximity might give her leverage again, and she said, "Ethan, if this is about money or something stupid, we can fix it." And there it was, the assumption that this was negotiable, that everything still operated within the rules she understood. I shook my head once, slow, steady, and said, "This is not about fixing anything. Because some things are not meant to be repaired, they are meant to be recognized for what they are, and then left behind." I reached into the drawer beside the counter and pulled out a single envelope, plain, unmarked, something that had been sitting there long before tonight, waiting for the exact moment it would no longer be optional, and I placed it gently on the surface between us, not sliding it, not forcing it toward her, just setting it down like it belonged there. Her eyes dropped to it immediately, then back to me, and I could see the shift again, deeper this time, because whatever she had expected, it was not this, not something prepared, not something finalized. "You planned this," she said quietly, and for the first time there was no accusation in her voice, just realization. And I met her gaze without hesitation and said, "I prepared." Because there is a difference. One comes from anger, the other comes from clarity. And I had been clear for longer than she understood. She stared at the envelope like it might open itself, like it might explain everything without her having to face it, but nothing moved, and neither did I. Because this was the part where she had to decide if she was ready to see what was already set in motion, and as the seconds passed, I realized she was finally beginning to understand that this was not a reaction, this was the outcome. Olivia did not touch the envelope at first, just stared at it like it might disappear if she waited long enough, like this could still shift back into something familiar, something she could manage, but nothing moved, and neither did I, because this was no longer about convincing her, it was about letting reality settle in at its own pace. "What is this?" she finally asked, her voice quieter now, stripped of the control she had been holding on to all night, and I watched her carefully, not answering immediately, because some questions do not need explanation, they need recognition. She reached for it slowly, almost cautiously, like the weight of it had already changed, and when her fingers touched the edge I saw it, that moment where everything connects, where the past few minutes stop being separate pieces and start forming a clear picture, one she could no longer avoid. "You said we could talk," she added, but it did not sound like a strategy anymore, it sounded like a request, something closer to asking for time, for a space, for a version of this where things were not already decided. I let out a small breath, not frustrated, not angry, just certain, and said, "We are talking." Because this was the conversation, not the kind filled with arguments or explanations, but the kind where actions speak louder than anything either of us could say. She opened the envelope then, slower than necessary, like she was delaying the inevitable, and as she looked down at what was inside, her expression shifted again, not dramatically, just enough to show that the last piece had fallen into place. I did not need to see the papers to know what she was reading. I had read them enough times already, signed them, finalized them, made sure there was no confusion about what came next. She looked back up at me, searching for something, anything that suggested this was not final, and for a brief second, I could see the version of us we used to be reflected in her eyes, the version that believed in permanence, in trust, in something that could not be undone. But that version was gone, replaced by something quieter, something clearer, and I met her gaze without hesitation and said, "It is already done." Because karma does not arrive with noise or warning, it arrives in moments like this, calm, certain, and impossible to reverse, and as the silence settled one last time between us, I realized she had spent months believing she was hiding the truth, never realizing she was walking straight toward the end of her own story.